Hey, Jeff Pixley here from Pixley for Congress. I'm making a video today that is about 15 days cooking in my head. And it's about some of the comments that were made in Quantico, Virginia, when the Secretary of Defense and the President addressed the senior officers and senior enlisted leaders from across the military services. So I'm not going to cover the entirety of the address. There's some really smart folks out there who've picked that apart. And I have strong feelings about a lot of things that were said and about the reaction to the leaders in the armed forces in that on that day and in the days that followed. But I think it's being well covered by experts on in some of those areas, and I don't want to beat a dead horse. I think there's plenty of content out there, but I do have one area I really want to talk about, and it's an area that not only am I passionate about, but it's something that I have a level of expertise in that I feel like me weighing in is not just some other voice that is complaining about the current administration. This is something that I have some background in, and that was the discussion from the Secretary of Defense about basic training. And I'm not going to clip it here. I don't have the video technical skills to give you the clip here. But if you watched the presentation, you'll recall that the Secretary of Defense made a remark, something along the lines of, "We're going to make basic training hard again," which is includes the allegation that somehow basic training isn't hard. And then talked about how he was going to once again permit uh, drill instructors, military trained instructors to yell at basic trainees and to swear at basic trainees, do what are called shark attacks to basic trainees. I'll explain that in a minute. Uh, and to put their hands on basic trainees. And there are folks who probably watched that and that flew past them. That didn't seem like a controversial statement, but it was one of the most alarming things from the presentation to me. So I want to talk about it for a few minutes. I'll back up all the way to 1990, which is when I enlisted in the Air Force. So I went to basic training in 1990. And if you, Secretary Hegseth said the reset point he's shooting for is 1990, which I thought was interesting given my timing. But I entered the Air Force in 1990, and I went to basic training at Lackland Air Force Base, Texas. And at the time, there were rules at basic training about swearing. MTIs, military training instructors, weren't allowed to swear at us. They did. They weren't allowed to put their hands on us. They did. And somehow I made it through. And it is a pretty common perspective for folks who've been through basic training, even if it was done improperly or there were rules that were violated. The nature of basic training and that transition from being a civilian into being a military member is an abrupt transition for folks, and it's a formative period in our lives that often people will forgive missteps or transgressions, believing that it was part of their growth and attributing their growth as a human being that's natural and when going through basic training, attributing it somehow, if not mostly, to the intensity of the environment and some of the abuses that occurred. There are years and years of studies directly related to military training and outside of military training, psychological studies about why that might be. I don't have time to go into that with you, but I'll tell you that even as a basic trainee, I recognized that the rule breaking didn't make sense and it was hard to defend. But like most folks, when I got out of basic training, I was glad to have it behind me, and I didn't give it a whole lot of thought until later in my career. And that later point in my career was when I was sent to basic training as a leader. Instead of being there as a basic training, I went back as a senior major, almost lieutenant colonel, in a leadership role. And I was sent there in the aftermath of the Air Force's sexual assault scandal that really hit national news in 2012. So in early 2013, I was sent to Lackland Air Force Base as part of the solution to what had been identified as a problem of failed leadership. And the diagnosis for that failed leadership included the lax enforcement of rules and the weakening of the safeguards to protect basic trainees. And those breakdowns were responsible for some pretty horrendous stuff, including sexual assaults that occurred at basic training. It was a really difficult time to be in that organization, but it was a, a thrilling time to be part of an organization that had just had a major upheaval, and we were being asked to professionalize it to earn the trust back of the American people. If you've ever sent a family member off to basic training, there's a vote of trust that happens when you send someone to go do that, to serve their country in basic training. So that environment is one where you expect folks to be on their game. So I did that for about 6 months and fell in love with the mission, had an amazing time crafting new policy and helping convince the kind of entrenched uh, folks who had a certain way of doing business in their minds, to convince them there was a better way to do business that would end up with the uh, as good or better results on the and the outcomes of basic training. That is, disciplined and committed troops graduating from basic training, but without resorting to the inappropriate and abusive techniques that have become a habit for some and basically the primary technique for others. Did that for 6 months, and then a year later, I got to go back and be a squadron commander. And for those that aren't Air Force or military minded, that's a group of I had about 75 folks that worked for me, and on any given day, about 1,000 basic trainees in my unit, 17 to 39-year-old folks going through basic training. And during those 2 years, we built on the successes that we had started in 2012 and 2013 to rid ourselves of bad practices, focus on science based, evidence based ways of increasing basic trainee performance, getting them to commit to our core values, and to graduate basic training feeling in their hearts a commitment to something and doing the right thing because they were internally driven to do the right thing instead of doing the right thing out of fear. And a fear based system sounds a lot like what Secretary Hegseth was describing. The rules during that period included zero touching. A military training instructor wasn't allowed to put their hands on a basic trainee unless there was unless they had permission and there was a training necessity to do so. For example, fixing a uniform item or demonstrating a first aid technique or how to handle a weapon. Those were legitimate reasons, but poking in the chest or taking the brim of your hat and hitting a basic trainee in the face or the forehead with the brim of your hat, which was a fairly common technique, those were forbidden, and those were forbidden for good reasons. And uh, did that for 2 years, and we made great strides in improving it, improving that the environment there, and we graduated a whole crop, thousands of basic trainees who lived up to our expectations and went out and did great work in the Air Force. Uh, but I'll tell you, every day of our time there was a battle on this front, and here's why. This is not because the military training instructors were bad actors or didn't want to follow the rules. It's because all of them went through basic training themselves, and it is incredibly common for folks to, when placed in an environment where they're now in charge of something they went through as a recipient of the training, they're going to resort to the techniques they recall from their time in training themselves. Whether or not the training was valid, and if their memory of it is even accurate, uh, honestly, there's a ton of pitfalls associated with that, and not the least of which is not understanding why something was done to you when you were basic training. When you come back years later and now you're dishing it out, if you don't understand why it was done in the first place, you can quickly fall into the world of maltraining and maltreatment as defined by the rules of the Air Force or your military service. I did that for 2 years, and it was a great job. In fact, I loved it so much. 5 years later, when I was given the opportunity to go back, I did, and I ran basic training for the whole Air Force. So Lackland Air Force Base is where we do that. And for 2 years, I was the commander of Air Force Basic Training, and uh, that tour included constant battles on this front to make sure we follow the rules. and to ensure that when basic trainees were coming to basic training, they were getting professional training that was science based, focused on making them better and driving their performance up through legitimate training techniques. There's no cussing wasn't allowed, and obviously putting your hands on someone was not permitted. Uh, I could go on and on about the why behind those things, but I'm going to talk about the cussing thing because it's something that's so frequently misunderstood, I think, by folks. And when I talked about the discipline that we expected of our instructors to refrain from using inappropriate language with basic trainees, one of the first things people would often ask me is, well, if someone can't handle being cussed at, how are they going to handle being shot at? Well, that the issue is not whether or not they can handle it. Basic trainees often expect to be cursed at, and it was rare for me to hear a complaint from a basic trainee about being sworn at, with the complaint being I was offended by the foul language. That was almost never the case. The truth is, in our professional interactions in the Air Force and in the military more broadly, it's expected to act and talk like professionals. And teaching someone through using foul language, especially if it's vulgar language associated with with sex acts or crude language, other kinds of crude language, it just sets a terrible example of low professionalism. So we expected our training instructors to find a way to convey the same information, convey the same amount of their high desire or the high expectations they have of the basic trainees without resorting to basically dirty language. And it doesn't mean that they have sensitive ears, the basic trainees. That wasn't what it was about at all. It was about just being professional and modeling the behavior we expected of basic trainees. In fact, I often pointed out that the basic trainees were also allowed to expected to use professional language. I thought it was odd that someone would advocate for an instructor to have a lower standard of conduct than we expected the basic trainees. That makes no sense whatsoever. And then the putting hands on basic trainees is another clear example. We took that very seriously. In fact, we had a minimum distance that we couldn't get any closer to basic training unless there were specific reasons to do so, and that was just to remove any doubt about what had happened in a training environment, to make sure that there's a basic trainee wouldn't perceive uh, a threat of physical violence as part of the training, because that's never the point, at least not in Air Force basic training. So back to Quantico. To have the Secretary of Defense stand up and say, uh, you can cuss at them again, you can flip their mattresses over in the room and tear up the dormitories again, and you can cuss at them again. I don't, in my heart of hearts, I don't think anybody in leadership at basic training at Lackland or anywhere else took that, wrote down notes, and immediately penned a letter saying, "All right, fights on, go have at it, have fun." All those rules are taken away. Um, they could have, but I doubt it, because they know, the people who study this know that it's not more effective training. It's just easier for the instructors to have lower standards of conduct, and that's no way to run a rodeo. So if they didn't make it, a free for all at basic training, why am I worried about it? I'm worried about it because we spent years teaching our instructors how to connect with and motivate and inspire those young people using legitimate training techniques that didn't resort to maltraining and maltreatment. It was hard, and there was a lot of pushback for the cultural reasons I talked about how they were brought up, but it required active effort on their part to meet that high standard. And now that the highest level of the military, the Secretary of Defense, has publicly stated that those rules were too onerous, that they were creating weak basic trainees, we have fed into the narrative that a basic trainee is not getting real basic training unless they're abused, or unless we let those things happen, which essentially is a recipe for disaster. Now, is every basic training trainer, whether it's a drill instructor at one of the other services or a military training instructor at Lackland, are they going to necessarily resort to these bad techniques? No, they're not. In fact, I would argue that fewer than 5%, maybe as low as 1%, are going to see this permission structure and take advantage of it. But when you have 750 military training instructors at Lackland Air Force Base, if only 1% see this as a ticket to abuse their basic trainees, that's more than 7 people who are going to be out there abusing basic trainees. Add to that the fact that the Secretary of Defense, in the same speech, talked about uh, making the IG Inspector General complaint system and other ways for folks to complain about maltreatment broadly in the military harder and set a higher standard of proof. There's a The recipe is now in for horrendous abuses to occur at basic training. And my fear is not that all military training instructors are going to suddenly become abusers. My fear is that one or two will, and the others, fearing that saying something is going to make them look like they're not on board with the Secretary of Defense initiative for making us more lethal, they're going to say nothing while the abuse happens, and the abuse is going to get worse and worse. And I fear that we are, months or years away from another scandal that is going to rock the Air Force and undo all the great work we did. So I hope that at Lackland right now they are talking about this. But having been the commander down there, I know what it's like to be in a room with hundreds of military training instructors who have one of the hardest jobs in the Air Force. When they feel like the tools they have to be effective are being taken away, they respond very predictably, and it's not awesome. So I hope they're down there finding a way to tackle this and mitigate the potential downsides of this. But my prediction is it's going to get ugly, and it's unfortunate, and it's an unnecessary, unforced error. And the San Antonio Express News and good old Sid Christensen down there, I fear, is going to have uh, plenty of stories to write in the coming years. So um, that's my take on the basic training portion of it. I'd be interested in your feedback on this, especially if you have experience in basic training. I only have my 4.5 years there, but it was in a position where I had the whole site picture. I think I have a pretty solid understanding of it. But if you disagree with me, or if you saw something I didn't see, or if you have more recent experience in basic training, send a note in the comments. I'd be interested to hear what you have to say. But I fear that we've created a permission structure that is going to invite bad things to happen to our basic training. So it's going to harm us, our services. Um, so check out pixleyforcongress.com. If you have a way to chip into the campaign, please do. We can welcome donations from across the country, because what happens in Oklahoma's 4th District affects all of the United States of America. And if you're here in Oklahoma and want to volunteer for the campaign, you can do it by going to our website and clicking on the button saying I want to volunteer. Until next time, we'll see you out there.